In 1985, two ambitious British climbers, Joe Simpson and Simon Yates, set their sights on a formidable challenge. They aimed to conquer the unclimbed west face of Sierra Grande in the remote Peruvian Andes. Their ascent was a masterpiece of alpinism. For days, they battled steep ice fields and treacherous rock, moving with precision and courage. The mountain tested their every skill, pushing them to their physical and mental limits. After a grueling climb, they reached the summit. Exhausted but triumphant, they had achieved their goal. The view was breathtaking, a reward for their incredible effort. But the true ordeal was only just beginning. The descent proved far more dangerous than the climb. The weather turned quickly, and their exhaustion made every step a risk. They had to navigate the same difficult terrain, but now with fading light and energy. Suddenly, disaster struck. While descending an ice cliff, Joe's footing gave way. He fell awkwardly, his body tumbling down the steep slope, his leg twisting beneath him in a horrifying way. An agonizing crack echoed across the ice. Joe looked down to see his right leg bent at an impossible angle. He had shattered his tibia, driving it up through his knee joint. It was a catastrophic injury. At over 20,000 feet, such an injury was a death sentence. Escape seemed impossible. They were miles from help, alone in a vast, frozen wilderness with a storm closing in fast. Simon faced a terrible choice: leave his friend to save himself or attempt a rescue that seemed doomed to fail. He refused to abandon Joe. He quickly devised a desperate plan to get them both down. Simon decided to lower Joe down the mountain. He tied their two 150-foot ropes together, creating one long line. He would lower Joe 300 feet, then climb down to join him and repeat the process. The pain for Joe was unimaginable. Every bump and jolt sent waves of agony through his shattered leg. He had to guide himself with his one good leg, trying to avoid further injury as he dangled from the rope. As darkness fell, a raging blizzard engulfed them. Howling winds and heavy snow reduced visibility to zero. They were cold, exhausted, and now completely disoriented, fighting for survival in the white chaos. In the blinding storm, Simon unknowingly lowered Joe over the edge of a massive, unseen cliff. Joe was left hanging in the void, suspended over a deep crevasse, unable to touch anything. Simon felt the rope go tight and couldn't pull Joe up. He held on for over an hour, the weight slowly pulling him from his precarious snow seat. He was slipping towards the edge himself. He screamed Joe's name into the wind, but heard nothing back. He didn't know Joe was dangling freely. He assumed Joe was stuck, wedged, or worse. The anchor was failing. Simon was faced with an impossible decision: hold on and they would both perish, pulled into the abyss, or make one terrible choice. He reached for the knife in his pack. With a heavy heart, believing Joe was already gone, Simon cut the rope. The tension vanished instantly. He had sent his friend falling into the darkness below to save his own life. Joe plummeted through the freezing air. He crashed through a thin crust of snow and landed on a narrow ledge deep inside the crevasse. Miraculously, the fall hadn't killed him. He was alive but trapped. Above him, the entrance was an unreachable hole of light. Below, a black abyss. He was alone, with a broken leg, no food, and quickly dwindling hope. For hours, he drifted in and out of consciousness. He assumed Simon was also dead, pulled from the mountain. He felt the cold seeping into his bones, a slow, inevitable end. But a flicker of survival instinct remained. He realized he still had the rope Simon had cut. He thought perhaps he could abseil further down, hoping to find another way out. He lowered himself into the absolute blackness. His headlamp was gone. He had no idea what was below him. It was a blind leap of faith, a final gamble against certain death. His feet touched a solid floor. He had found the bottom of the crevasse, and in the distance he saw it, a small slope leading up to an opening, a sliver of daylight. He dragged his useless leg behind him, clawing his way up the snow slope and out into the blinding sunlight. He had escaped the icy tomb, but his journey was far from over. He was now on the glacier, miles from their base camp. He had no food, no water, and a leg that was a source of constant, excruciating pain. The odds were still stacked impossibly against him. So he began to crawl. Inch by agonizing inch, he dragged himself across the glacier. He set small goals, the next rock, the next patch of snow, fighting off delirium and despair. The thirst was maddening. He ate snow to stay hydrated, knowing it was lowering his core body temperature, but he had no other choice. The sun burned his skin, and the cold froze him at night. His mind started to play tricks on him. He hallucinated, hearing music and voices that weren't there. A relentless internal monologue pushed him onward, a voice that refused to let him die. He focused on a simple rhythm: crawl for 20 minutes, rest for 5. This small discipline kept him moving, kept him sane, as he covered the miles over 3 agonizing days. Meanwhile, Simon had made it back to base camp, convinced Joe was dead. Racked with guilt and grief, he spent days burning Joe's clothes and preparing to make the lonely journey home. Joe finally reached the end of the glacier, only to face a new obstacle: a moraine field. It was a chaotic maze of sharp, unstable boulders, impossible to crawl over. He was forced to hop and stumble, falling repeatedly onto his shattered leg. The pain was beyond description, a white-hot fire that threatened to consume him completely. Each hop was a victory. Dehydration became his greatest enemy. His tongue was swollen, his throat raw. He was close to the end, his body shutting down. He crawled into what he thought would be his final resting place. He knew he was dying. His thoughts became fragmented, his energy gone. He collapsed, unable to move another inch, accepting his fate under the vast, indifferent sky. But then, through the haze of his delirium, he saw them, the tents of base camp. They were so close, yet seemed an impossible distance away. A final surge of adrenaline coursed through him. It was the middle of the night. Simon and their base camp manager were preparing to leave the next morning. They were listening to music, unaware of the miracle unfolding just outside their camp. Suddenly, Simon heard something. A faint, desperate cry carried on the wind. He dismissed it at first, thinking it was an animal or his imagination playing tricks on him. But he heard it again, a human voice calling out from the darkness of the moraine. He grabbed a flashlight and stumbled out of the tent, his heart pounding in his chest. The beam of his flashlight cut through the night and landed on a skeletal figure. It was Joe. He was emaciated, delirious, and barely recognizable, but he was alive. Simon couldn't believe his eyes. He rushed to Joe's side. The man he had left for dead on the mountain had crawled back to him. It was a moment of profound shock, relief, and disbelief. They carried him back to the tent, giving him what little water and food they had left. Joe had crawled for 3.5 days, covering nearly 6 miles of brutal terrain without food or water. The journey out was another ordeal, but they made it. Joe was eventually flown to a hospital in Lima. He would endure years of painful surgeries to save his leg from amputation. The story of their survival became legendary, but it was also steeped in controversy. Simon was heavily criticized by some in the climbing community for the decision to cut the rope. Joe, however, never blamed his partner. He has always fiercely defended Simon's decision, stating that it was the only logical choice and that it ultimately saved both their lives. Doctors told Joe he would never climb again. They said he would be lucky to walk without a limp. But the same iron will that drove him across the glacier pushed him through his recovery. Just 2 years after the accident, Joe Simpson was climbing again. He defied all expectations, returning to the high-altitude peaks that had almost claimed his life, proving his spirit was as unbreakable as ever. He documented his harrowing experience in the best-selling book, Touching the Void. The story captivated the world, becoming a raw and powerful testament to human endurance and the complexities of survival. Their friendship endured the unimaginable strain. The shared trauma forged a bond that few could understand, a quiet respect for the terrible choices made in the face of death. The story raises profound questions about loyalty, survival, and the impossible decisions people make under extreme pressure. What would you have done in Simon's position? What would you have done in Joe's? Ciel Grande remains a symbol of their ordeal and triumph. It represents the brutal beauty of nature and the razor-thin line between life and death that exists in the world's most unforgiving places. Joe's crawl back to life teaches us that the human spirit possesses an astonishing capacity for resilience. Even when faced with absolute hopelessness, the will to live can push us beyond any conceivable limit.